Namaskar and welcome to Samvad at Mayank. Today in Samvad, we have with us Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Ambassador Sinha has served as head of India's United Nations Affairs during its Security Council membership and was ambassador to the UN in Geneva. He was also ambassador to Greece. Ambassador Sinha has served in Pakistan and Bangladesh and was also the head of the Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan desk in the Ministry of External Affairs. Apart from his diplomatic achievements, he is also the author of two books: Legitimacy of Power, The Permanence of Five in the Security Council, and The Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty. So, welcome to Samvad, sir.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me.
Sir, since we are discussing Tibet, uh, I've been reading a lot on Tibet, and you are an expert on the issue. China claims that Tibet was always its, but we who are in the know somehow realize that that was not the case. But the Chinese argument, as it is, they're always very forceful, full of passion and power. So, what is the claim which China makes on Tibet as Tibet being always being part of China? And in your opinion, does this claim have any merit?
Well, the Chinese historians themselves are in disagreement, are not agreed on when Tibet became a part of China. Uh, some historians say that it became a part of China when the Manchus conquered China and Tibet in 1720. This was the Qing dynasty in China. Some say that no, it was earlier when the Yuan dynasty, which was a dynasty, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had set up the Yuan dynasty in China. He also ruled over Mongolia. So they say that Tibet became a part of China at that time. Some say no, it was even earlier in the Tang dynasty period. Themselves are not in agreement on this issue. The fact of the matter is that now, of course, the Chinese government, especially the present regime of Xi Jinping, claims Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, whatever that means. The fact of the matter is that no Chinese meaning Han Chinese army, ever entered Lhasa until the 20th century. Because the Qing dynasty, which was the Manchu dynasty, was not a Han Chinese dynasty. The Manchus were people who lived north of China. They conquered China. And when they conquered Tibet, they always appointed only a Manchu as the Amban, who was the kind of a high commissioner in Tibet, in Lhasa. So the first time a Han Chinese was appointed was actually only in the 20th century. So it really is farcical to claim that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times. In fact, Tibet's links with India were always much closer in ancient times. In fact, even today, it is much closer than it has ever been with China. China's claim, in any case, we have to accept that Tibet is a part of China today. But Tibet is a part of China today by military conquest. And the current conquest of Tibet took place in 1950 and 1951. After the Communist Party seized power in China, it invaded Tibet and occupied Tibet. So it is an imperial conquest. Tibet is a colony of China ruled over by the Communist Party. The secretary, who is the main functionary of the main ruler of Tibet, secretary of the Communist Party of Tibet, has always been a Han Chinese. The governor, etc., these are all supernumerary positions. They are Tibetans, but the main power rests in the hands of the secretary of the Communist Party of China, of Tibet, in Lhasa, and he's always been a Han Chinese.
The Hans, basically, what we know of the Hans, they despise the Manchus, and since or the imperial tradition, the communists have always been opposed to it. So somehow, but the legitimacy they claim on Tibet is because of this imperial conquests only. So there is a dichotomy of the imperial China and the communist China. So how does this conquer of places like Tibet and Xinjiang reconcile with the fact that the Chinese, the present Chinese, the communist Chinese, have despised the imperialists and more so the Manchus?
Yes, in fact, the in Manchu China, there were repeated revolts by the Han Chinese against Manchu rule. There was the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century, uh, which was a very strong rebellion, and the Manchu Empire almost collapsed. It
Hmm.
survived only because of European help. And then in the 20th century, when people like Sun Yat-sen revolted, they also led essentially a Han revolt. And if you read the writings of Sun Yat-sen, he wrote that China, the Han Chinese, were oppressed by the Manchus, and that Manchu rule was a foreign rule on
Hmm.
China. So these are all recorded by leading Chinese uh, leaders themselves. Now, when the Qing dynasty was overthrown in China, there was actually a genocide of the Manchus in various cities in China. And the Manchus then went into hiding,
Hmm.
and they hid their Manchu identity from the local Chinese because they were scared of being killed. And the Manchuria in the north of China, which had become part of China since the Manchu period, that Manchuria has now been divided into three provinces, and the Han Chinese have gone and settled down there. These are very fertile lands, and the population balance has changed.
Hmm.
So the Manchus have become a minority in their own country. And the fact is that the Manchus themselves were very oppressive on the Han Chinese.
Hmm.
You know, the pigtail that the Chinese were required to have, that was a Manchu imposition on the Chinese. The
Hmm.
Manchus never trusted the Chinese. The Chinese were always recruited, the Han Chinese were always recruited only in the forces which were stationed in the south of China, which was the warmer part of China, where the Manchus, who were people from the north, didn't want to live. And the, the empires in Xinjiang, in Mongolia, in Tibet, these were always ruled either by the Mongols or by the Manchus themselves. And the Han Chinese were never given these positions. So there was always this feeling in Han China that the Manchus were foreign rulers.
Hmm.
And it is very ironic that the Communist Party of China, after liberating what they call as liberating the people of China against the nationalist China, they conquered Tibet on the pretext of liberating Tibet,
Hmm.
and they claim all the territories that were ever ruled by the Manchus.
Hmm.
It was essentially an imperial philosophy, and the claims are all imperial claims based on military conquest of previous rulers.
So it's an irony that the communist Chinese become the successors to the imperialistic Chinese. And this is a paradox which only they can understand. But taking it further, sir, about the liberation, the conquest of Tibet, immediately after the establishment of the PRC in 1949, they announced that they'll be liberating all the Chinese territories, including Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hainan. So there seemed to be some sort of an urgency because otherwise, in any system, the government would first try to stabilize. But the PRC immediately declared that they'll be liberating these regions. So, what was the urgency behind this thought of immediate liberation of these provinces, especially Tibet?
Before I go into that question, let me also clarify that imperialism is actually inbuilt into the communist ideology because the communists claim to be the liberators of the proletariat of the downtrodden, which means they want to go into other countries and liberate their people. This is a very imperial idea. It's an idea like the British imperialists had, that they wanted to go and civilize the natives in other countries. So it's a very imperial idea of that the communists inherited from the imperialists of Europe, and Chinese Communist Party also inherited that idea. And that is why you get this idea that the Communist Party of China had to liberate the people of Tibet. It
Hmm.
said the serfs of Tibet were oppressed by the
Hmm. Hmm.
feudal lords and the religious lords there, and they wanted to come and liberate them. Uh, Now, one of the reasons why I think they were in a hurry to do this, and this is October 1950. Now, 4 months before that, in June 1950, a war had broken out in Korea,
Hmm.
where again the Soviet and Chinese supported forces in North Korea of Kim Il-sung had invaded southern Korea in order to spread communist rule over there. And the Korean War had started. So China expected that the war would soon spread into China, and they were right in that assessment of theirs. So they were very keen to complete the conquest of Tibet so that at least their backyard was not at risk. Now, China and Tibet, after Tibet declared independence, when the Manchu dynasty collapsed in 1912, 1 year later, Tibet declared independence. There were a lot of skirmishes between Tibet and China. And it was during this period that Mao, when he was fleeing South China in the famous Long March of his, he had come and stayed on the edge of the Tibetan plateau to escape the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. And at that time, the Tibetans used to attack the communist stragglers in the camp of Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong had an idea that this back yard of China should be secured before China opened the front in Korea. And this was actually vindicated by the fact that when the American forces pushed the communist forces in North Korea, they reached the border of China. And China had to send its forces into Korea to push back the Americans. So it was the Korean War that made Mao ensure that Tibet had been put on its back before that Korean War intensified.
So, were they also apprehensive of US intervention through Tibet while they were fighting in Korea? Was that also an apprehension?
That was also an apprehension because once the Korean War started, the Cold War had become very intense. And the Americans had taken upon themselves the mantle of fighting communism all across the world. And the fact that Tibet could be one of the places where the Americans would intervene was always there at the back of the minds of the Mao and his people. So that also was a factor. And in fact, soon after the communist invasion of Tibet, the Americans did offer to India to step in to push the Chinese communists back.
So, 1950s, a very young Dalai Lama in charge, the whole spiritual atmosphere against a battle-hardened Mao and his group, with the Cold War just starting. It was in the very nascent stages. Now they are arm twisted. The Tibetans are basically arm twisted into that 17-point agreement, which was the final nail in the coffin, I would say, for Tibet. So I would like you to basically elaborate on the salient points of the 17-point agreement. What was it all about?
See, when the Chinese forces attacked Tibet, they did not come to Lhasa immediately. They attacked in October 1950, and they came to this eastern town of Chamdo, and they stopped there because they were not sure what was the kind of defenses that were there in Lhasa. So they stopped there, and they tried to start negotiations. Now, the Dalai Lama was only 15 years old at this time, and he was still completing his studies. So he hurriedly completed all his tests and his curriculum. He passed that, and in December 1950, he moved to Yatung in the Chumbi Valley on the border of Sikkim. He fled there. He fled with his entire government. Now, he was still a minor, and the government was being run by the regent. And there was a fight among one regent and another regent within the people who were running the regency. And in fact, one of the regents had also died in prison. So there was a lot of chaos within Tibet at that time. And in this process came the Chinese. And they started, they took the governor of Chamdo, they imprisoned him. And then they started negotiations with him and asked him to negotiate as the mediator between Tibet and China. And eventually they took him to Beijing for negotiations. Now, this man, of course, he had been left high and dry because he tried to resist the Chinese forces, but he didn't have anything with him, and he was taken prisoner. Then he was taken to Beijing. And there the Chinese forced uh, this agreement on him.
Hmm.
The agreement, the 17-point agreement, was that China assured Tibet that it would respect all its religious institutions, it would respect especially the authority of the Dalai Lama, it would respect the local culture and the autonomy of Tibet, and only defense and foreign affairs would be handed over to the government in China. And this proposal was then presented to the Tibetans. The Dalai Lama, when he fled to Yatung, he appealed to the United Nations, to India, to the US, and to Britain for help. Now, none of these people came to his help, so he was left high and dry in Yatung. Eventually, when the treaty was presented to him by the Chinese through this mediator, they uh, he had no choice but to accept the 17-point agreement. But
Hmm.
actually, he accepted the 17-point agreement as a fait accompli because the agreement had been signed in May 1951 in Beijing itself. And he gave the cabinet, the Kashag as it is called,
Hmm.
in Yatung gave the approval after it had been signed by by the governor
Hmm.
of Chamdo in Beijing. But yes, they gave their consent. They accepted the authority of the Chinese, and then the Chinese general who was to command the forces, he then flew down to Calcutta. From Calcutta, he flew to Bagdogra, and from Bagdogra, he took a land route, went to Tibet. He met the Dalai Lama in Yatung, and then he went ahead of the Dalai Lama to Lhasa. And
Hmm.
it was only after the Dalai Lama reached Lhasa 2 or 3 days after the Chinese general. Then the Chinese forces came from Chamdo and entered Lhasa. This was September 1950. So while the invasion took place almost a year later, the Chinese forces entered Lhasa, and the Dalai Lama tried to make do with the forces. One of the interesting stories is that when the Chinese forces entered Lhasa, there was a shortage of food. About 10, 20,000 Chinese soldiers had come in. There
Hmm.
wasn't enough food. So China asked India to send rice. So India sent its rice for at least 2 or 3 years. Of course, China paid that rice back in kind to India. But the food, the rice to support the Chinese forces in Lhasa for the first 1 or 2 years was sent from India.
So this period between 1950, the agreement till 1959, it's a very unstable period for the Tibetan people also. There are lots of to's and fro's going about. But 10th March 1959, just a couple of days ago, the anniversary happened just a couple of days ago, there was an uprising. After that, Dalai Lama escapes. Now, there are people who say that he was allowed to escape by Mao because otherwise it was not possible for him to escape. Others say it was a daredevil act by the Dalai Lama. Now, this whole sequence from the 10th of March, what happened on the 10th of March till Dalai Lama's escape, what happened?
See, after the Dalai Lama went back to Lhasa in 1951, he tried to coexist peacefully with the Chinese forces, which was not very easy. In 1954, he was invited to come to Beijing. So he went to Beijing along with the Panchen Lama. They were treated there, and they were also given some high rank in the Chinese government. But obviously, the treatment given to a lot of the Tibetan delegates was not very good because after staying there for some months, they came back to Tibet, and that is when the uprising against the Chinese starts in
Hmm.
Tibet. There were a number of people who had become disgruntled with the Chinese. You see, when the Chinese came to Tibet, one of the reasons why the Tibetans were kind of willing to accept, some Tibetans were willing to accept the Chinese, was that the Tibetans did not, they thought that the Chinese would be like the Manchu rulers. The Manchu rulers had conquered Tibet, but they did not really destroy the local culture. In fact, they revered the local culture. They were Buddhists and they were Tibetan Buddhists. So they used to revere the Dalai Lama. They used to send gifts to the Dalai Lama. So it was a different kind of a relationship that the Manchus had with the Tibetans. So many Tibetans felt that perhaps the communists also would have the same kind of relationship with Tibet. But uh, when the the great leap forward started and the oppression of the Tibetans started, then they realized that this was a completely different kind of force that they were dealing with. And the destruction of the monasteries started. Uh, there was a shortage of food. The Tibetan people revolted against the
Mm,
Chinese forces. The revolt started somewhere in 1955-56 itself, because in 1956, the Dalai Lama came to India,
mm,
as did Chow Enlai. They came for the 2500 Parinirvan Divas of uh, Mahatma Buddha, and they were both here in Delhi at that time. Uh, the Dalai Lama did not want to go back to Tibet, but he was persuaded by our Prime Minister to go back and try and make peace with the Chinese. So he went back. And after he went back, the revolt had become very strong. The people of Lhasa were revolting against the people. And there were strong rumors that the Chinese would arrest the Dalai Lama. In March 1959, when this pricing became very strong, uh, one of the things that happened was that the Chinese invited the Dalai Lama to come to a military function.
mm,
The Tibetans were convinced that this was a ruse to arrest him, to invite him to the military camp and to arrest him there. So, and the Dalai Lama uh, agreed with this thing. So in the dark of the night, he fled with his people, and he did not take the normal route to come towards Sikkim.
mm,
He took a slightly different route, a more difficult route to go towards Tawang, because he was scared that the Chinese would try and catch him. Now, were the Chinese aware of his departure? There is no evidence of that.
mm,
The Chinese may have been, we don't know.
mm,
But quite certainly, the Dalai Lama's escape was secret. And when the Chinese got to know that the Dalai Lama had escaped, the operation they let loose upon the Tibetan people was very brutal.
mm,
So it is not as if they were happy to see the Dalai Lama go or they wanted him to go. The Dalai Lama escaped from
mm,
their clutches, and he came rapidly towards Tawang. He wasn't even sure of the kind of welcome he would get in India.
mm.
But once he came to Tawang, of course, we welcomed him and gave him shelter in India, along with thousands of other Tibetan refugees who came to India.
So India shared a very peaceful border with Tibet for thousands of centuries, and the cultural exchange was very vibrant. But somehow we fail to anticipate as to what exactly the communist China was intending to do in Tibet. Maybe, I'm not very sure. You'll enlighten me on that. But we were sending rice, despite the fact that Sardar Patel had written a letter to the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, warning him of the dangers which was forthcoming. So could we have done more to help the Tibetan cause? We did not help them in the UN also. So my thing, I've always been trying to understand that could we have done more to help the Tibetans, or it was beyond our reach to help Tibet, as the Prime Minister used to say in those days.
Well, you rightly said that the India-Tibet border, very long, India's longest border, has been one of the most peaceful, not only for our subcontinent, but in the whole world. It's very difficult to find a border as peaceful as this, as long, almost 4,000 kilometers long, and extremely peaceful. And the number of times forces have crossed, military has crossed this border, you can count on your fingertips.
Mm,
Most of the time, it was pilgrims, monks, traders, scholars who used to cross across on both sides, carrying knowledge with them, carrying goods with them. The first time a hostile power took over
mm,
was in 1950-51 when the Communist Party came into the border. Now, the communists at this time put forward an image, projected an image of being a very modern uh, philosophy, a modern party that stood for world peace. It stood for the poor people in the world. It stood for human values, human rights. Many people were taken in by this
mm,
by this ideology. Even in India, there were many admirers of this.
mm,
On the contrary, the theocracy in Tibet did not appeal to many people in India because it was obscurantist. You believed in incarnation and you believed in religious control, which was never a bright thing in India. So the sympathy among many of the Indian intellectuals was for the communists rather than for the Tibetans.
mm,
But the people who were on ground, not just our deputy prime minister, but the people who were on ground, like our representatives in Lhasa,
mm,
then our representative in Sikkim, Harishwar Dayal, these people were warning that
mm,
the communists are not up to any good. And they said that the frontier between India and Tibet had never been clearly defined.
mm,
And any hostile power could come and start challenging this.
mm,
So they warned,
mm,
as did the deputy prime minister. But the feeling in India was that the border dispute wasn't really a dispute. It could be resolved very easily. The communists were essentially friendly people, and there was nothing to fear from them. So we were taken in by all this. We did not realize that the Communist Party of China was also an imperial party,
mm.
and it was reclaiming territory that was ruled by its predecessor, the not its predecessor, but the previous rulers of China, like the Qing and the Yuans. So it was a very dangerous ideology. But we made the mistake. Now the question that you asked, could we have done more?
Mm.
Certainly. Now, whether we could have done anything militarily or not, I cannot comment on that because I'm not a military expert. And I have read that some of our military people at that time felt that we could not intervene. So I will not go into that issue, although I have my views on that. But since I'm not an expert on that, I will not
Would be interesting to hear those
present them
views,
to you
sir.
here.
Would be interesting to
I
hear
sorry.
those views.
Well, I would first say that what we could easily have done is the diplomatic moves.
Hmm.
Diplomatic moves. We could have easily taken up Tibet's case in the UN Security Council because we were members of the UN, and here was a neighbor of ours that was attacked by an imperial power. We had taken up the case of Indonesia in the UN. We had taken up the case of apartheid in South Africa in the UN. We were promoting the independence of all colonies, but we did not take up the case of Tibet. That was a major mistake that we made, with the result that today nobody questions China's claim to Tibet. No country in the world says that China's claim to Tibet is incorrect.
Hmm.
Whereas everybody regards Jammu and Kashmir as disputed territory.
Hmm.
Many people regard even Arunachal Pradesh as disputed territory because China insists it is disputed.
Hmm.
So why didn't we dispute Tibet and at least put the Tibet dispute on the world map?
Hmm.
That is not the case. Now you ask me what my views militarily.
Yes, sir.
Remember, this was 1950.
Yes, sir.
5 years earlier, there were 2 million Indians who were fighting for the Allied powers. These were all battle-hardened soldiers who
Yes.
had helped the British Empire and the Allied powers defeat the Axis powers. We had fought in the battles in North Africa, in the Middle East. Uh, why could we not have taken up the cause of Tibet militarily? Tibet, Lhasa is much closer to India from Sikkim than it is to any other part of China.
Hmm.
The supply lines to Lhasa were always through India. I feel that we could have intervened militarily, but we did not do that. So now we face the consequences that China has now become the biggest threat to India, not just the land threat along the northern border, but China having become a major naval power also threatens India from the south. And this is the first time in India's history that the same power is threatening us both from the north and from the south.
Yes, sir.
That is land threat as well as the naval threat. This has never happened to India before. So we have a very peculiar and a very high level of security threat to our country.
Sir, the biggest cyber threat also comes from China,
Yeah, absolutely.
Chinese origin. I'll cut to
Yes.
the present, sir. For the last question, I'll cut to the present. And we have seen a migration, and the Tibetan cause was basically centered in India, Dharamshala being the center. But recently, we have seen that the Tibetan youth are migrating to the West, especially US. Now, I would like to understand whether this migration is basically would turn adversarial for the Tibetan cause itself. In a nutshell, sir, will spiritual Tibet give way to neo-imperialistic China? Is the story over?
No, it's certainly not over. It's not over because the the Chinese have not been able to win the hearts and minds of the people of Tibet. the very fact that they are oppressing the people of Tibet, they are destroying the culture of Tibet, they're not allowing Tibetans to study Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan history, means they are scared of the people of Tibet. The fact that they have closed the borders with India, they don't allow the Tibetans outside to go to travel to Tibet. They don't allow foreigners to travel to Tibet. This means that they are scared of the people of Tibet. As long as the people of Tibet inside Tibet keep resisting the Chinese cause cannot be destroyed. So the Tibetan cause cannot be destroyed. Uh, Similarly, the people who are living abroad, the largest number lives in India, then in Nepal, and then they are in other parts of the world. Now, it is true that many Tibetans who have been living in India are migrating westwards. That is mainly for economic reasons. There are thousands of Indians also migrating westwards. So we can't prevent Tibetans from leaving. Uh, there are better economic opportunities outside. I don't think this will affect the Tibetan cause at all. In fact, it may actually benefit the Tibetan cause because as long as the Tibetans are there in a free country, they can develop their cultural ideas as they were able to preserve their Tibetan culture in India. They are preserving the Tibetan culture in Europe and in America. And in the free atmosphere there, they are able to work on on their own people to promote the Tibetan cause. They are financially strong enough to support the Tibetan cause. So I think that the cause will be kept up whether the Tibetans in exile live in India or in the West. Of course, in India they are more at home because culturally we are much closer to each other. But in India, we do not allow them to indulge in political activity. Whereas in other countries, they can indulge in, they can be more vocal of their rights. So I think in India also we should allow them to be a little more vocal and support their cause a lot more than just the economic assistance or the cultural assistance that we provide to them.
Sir, I'm in absolute agreement with your views that we should be a bit more flexible with the Tibetan cause and the Tibetan people now, and maybe allow them to speak up politically. And we also need to speak up politically and academically in whatever ways we can for a very just cause. And I would like to conclude on that note itself. Thank you so much for sparing time for us, and we look forward to hearing your views on another issue soon, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.